Imagine a world where the sky was not just empty space, but a living battlefield, where every sunrise was a victory and every sunset was a gamble against chaos itself. A world where gods didn't just sit in lofty temples, but worked exhausting double shifts to keep the universe running, and humans, instead of being grateful, often mocked them for getting old or showing weakness. Welcome to the strange, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying world of Egyptian mythology, a place where family drama, betrayal, resurrection, cosmic warfare, and divine mistakes shaped not only the religion of one of the greatest civilizations in history, but also left us with lessons that still whisper through time. Tonight we begin with the figure who in many ways embodied the sheer relentlessness of existence itself. Ra, the sun god, the original overachiever, the divine worker who never once had the luxury of a sick day. To truly understand Ra, imagine being told your job was to not only keep the sun burning, but also steer it across the heavens every single day in a golden boat, while simultaneously defending the entire cosmos from a monster serpent the size of a skyscraper every single night, without fail. This was Ra's daily grind, and unlike us, he didn't have unions, overtime pay, or weekends. What fascinates me most is how relatable this struggle feels. Beneath the grandeur, Ra is a symbol of endurance, of that human experience where the weight of responsibility feels endless. Because while he lit the world during the day, by night he entered Duat, the Egyptian underworld, to wage battle against Apophis, the chaos serpent. Think about that. After a 12-hour shift keeping humanity alive, his reward was fighting for his life against a monster determined to erase everything, and he had to win, because if he lost even once, creation itself would collapse. No Netflix binge, no naps, just a constant cycle of obligation. And here's where Egyptian mythology isn't just entertaining but deeply philosophical. Because Ra isn't perfect. In fact, he grows old, he gets mocked by humans, and in one of the most dramatic responses ever recorded, he unleashes Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of vengeance, to punish humanity. But things spiral out of control until near-total destruction looms. This moment captures something timeless, the paradox of power. When those entrusted with ultimate authority feel disrespected, they often lash out with catastrophic consequences. It's an ancient reflection of the dangers of ego and leadership without restraint. Yet, after that near disaster, Ra doesn't storm off in permanent rage. He retreats, ruling from a distance, almost like a burned-out CEO who realizes micromanaging mortals is a thankless task. What remains most powerful about Ra is not his perfection, but his fatigue, his determination despite exhaustion, his role as a god who labors endlessly, and the fact that even divine figures can stumble under the weight of responsibility. In Ra, we don't just see a sun god. We see a mirror of ourselves, the worker, the parent, the leader, the one who shoulders more than anyone should but keeps going, because if they don't, everything falls apart. And isn't that the essence of human endurance? That quiet, relentless persistence that holds the world together every single day. If Ra is the relentless engine of the cosmos, then Osiris is the tragic figure who reminds us that even gods can fall victim to jealousy, betrayal, and family politics so dark they make modern soap operas look tame. Osiris began as the golden ruler, the god of agriculture, fertility, and the afterlife, beloved by mortals for teaching them farming, winemaking, and civilization itself. In many ways he was the god who gave humanity order, prosperity, and a sense of purpose. But here's the lesson embedded in his myth. Greatness often paints a target on your back. His brother Set, consumed by envy, devised one of the most devious betrayals in mythology, crafting a coffin perfectly measured to Osiris's body, inviting him to a feast, and tricking him into lying inside. Once Osiris was sealed in that coffin and tossed into the Nile, the cycle of betrayal and vengeance began. What fascinates me is that this isn't just a divine story, it mirrors human history. How often do we see leaders, innovators, or even beloved figures brought down not by their failures, but by those closest to them? Threatened by their light, Osiris's story takes a darker turn when Set dismembers his body into 14 pieces, scattering them across Egypt. This grotesque act wasn't just murder, it was erasure, an attempt to annihilate Osiris's identity, to splinter him so thoroughly he could never return. But here's where mythology transcends brutality, because Isis, his sister wife, embodies love and resilience so powerful she literally reassembles him piece by piece, even creating a missing part out of gold. The symbolism here is astonishing. It suggests that devotion, determination, and creativity can reforge what is broken. Even when destruction seems complete, Osiris doesn't return to rule among the living. Instead, he takes his place as the judge of souls in the underworld. And this transition is deeply meaningful. In life he was a ruler, in death he becomes the arbiter of morality, weighing hearts against the feather of Mat. Imagine that his downfall transforms him into something even greater, the ultimate reminder that our greatest legacy may not lie in our victories, but in what we become after our wounds. Osiris's myth warns us about betrayal, but it also offers a strange kind of hope, that from dismemberment, whether literal or metaphorical, new authority and new meaning can rise. To me, Osiris symbolizes how suffering can strip us of worldly power but lead us toward deeper wisdom. He becomes less of a king and more of a principle, a figure who turns loss into justice. And his story resonates because we've all faced moments where we were torn apart by grief, betrayal, or failure, yet somehow those moments create a new role for us, not the one we wanted, but perhaps the one we were meant to fill. Osiris reminds us that the measure of a person or a god is not how they live untouched, but how they endure fragmentation and still find a way to serve something larger than themselves. If Osiris is the wounded king who finds purpose in death, then Isis is the force that proves love, intelligence, and relentless determination can bend even the rules of gods. She is not just the grieving widow or the supportive sister, she is the architect of rebirth, the strategist who turns despair into triumph, and the mother whose resilience keeps the world in balance. Isis is perhaps the most relatable and simultaneously most formidable of the Egyptian pantheon, because she is defined not by raw power like Ra or Set, but by cunning, endurance, and a refusal to accept defeat. When Set dismembered Osiris, Isis did not collapse into grief. Instead, she embarked on an impossible scavenger hunt across Egypt, gathering his fragmented body parts, and when she discovered the most vital piece was missing, she did not give up. She created a substitute out of gold and carried on. This detail, as bizarre as it sounds, is powerful. It tells us that devotion is not about perfection, but about persistence. Even when reality is incomplete, Isis's magic revives Osiris long enough to conceive Horus, the Avenger's son, and this act transforms her from mourner to mother, from wife to foundation of dynasties, yet her power extends further. She is a master manipulator of divine secrets, famously tricking Ra himself into revealing his hidden name, essentially stealing the password to his cosmic authority by inventing a venomous snake and then offering to heal him only if he surrendered his secret. This moment is fascinating because it reveals the subversive nature of her strength while Ra embodies sheer endurance. Isis embodies intelligence, resourcefulness, and the courage to challenge authority itself. In this sense, she is not just a goddess. She is a prototype for every person who survives injustice, not by brute force, but by strategy. What makes Isis even more compelling is her dual role as protector and mourner. She raises Horus alone in the marshes, fending off assassins, crocodiles, and demons. The image of her nursing her child in hiding while whispering spells of protection is profoundly human. How many mothers across history have done the same, shielded their children from hostile worlds with nothing but determination and love? In Isis, we find a reflection of that timeless truth, that protection often comes not from strength, but from vigilance and sacrifice. Her popularity in Egypt was immense, not just among royalty, but among everyday people. Women modeled themselves after her, priests invoked her name for healing, and her image as a winged goddess became a symbol of divine care. Even beyond Egypt, Isis's cult spread into Rome and Greece, her worship outlasting many of the other gods, which tells us that her story speaks to something universal: the need for a figure who embodies not destruction or dominance, but resilience, cunning, and maternal strength. When we think of Isis, we should not just imagine a goddess weeping over her husband, but a strategist who redefined loss into legacy, who built dynasties from ashes, and who proved that even in a world of cosmic chaos, the power of a single determined woman could alter the fate of gods and men alike. If Isis is the grieving strategist and Osiris the fallen king, then Horus is the embodiment of vengeance turned into justice. The child born of loss, whose very existence is a protest against oblivion. Horus grows up not in palaces but in swamps, hidden away with his mother, learning to survive against crocodiles, snakes, and assassins. His childhood is a metaphor for resilience born in exile. The idea that greatness often begins in struggle rather than comfort. When he reaches maturity, Horus does not simply claim his throne. He must fight for it against Set, his uncle, the murderer of his father. And this conflict stretches on for 80 years, longer than the lifespan of most mortals. Think about that: justice delayed for decades, with trials, duels, betrayals, and courtroom battles among the gods themselves. This endless struggle tells us something vital about how cultures understood power. It is not simply inherited. It must be tested, contested, and earned. The battles between Horus and Set are not just physical, they are psychological and even humiliating. At one point, Set tries to dominate Horus through trickery and violation. But Horus, with his mother's cunning, turns the act against him, proving that strength without intelligence collapses into farce. This episode, disturbing as it is, reveals a theme still relevant today, that justice requires both courage and strategy. Brute force alone cannot topple entrenched chaos. What makes Horus unique is that even when his eye is gouged out in battle, he continues, and when his eye is restored by divine intervention, it becomes the Eye of Horus, a symbol that endures across centuries, representing healing, protection, and restoration. There is something profoundly moving about this image, because the Eye of Horus is not unscarred perfection. It is a wound healed, a piece broken and made whole again. And that is why it resonates. It reminds us that true power is not the absence of injury, but the ability to recover and transform scars into symbols. When Horus finally triumphs, it is not merely a personal victory, but a cosmic one. His ascension to the throne represents the restoration of order over chaos, of rightful succession over treachery. But there is a darker undertone too, because his story is not pure triumph, it is also exhaustion, compromise, and bureaucracy, stretched over decades, a reminder that even divine justice is messy, complicated, and painfully slow. Perhaps this is why the Egyptians saw in Horus not just a god of kingship, but a mirror of their own rulers. Flawed men trying to embody divine justice while wrestling with chaos both within and without. To me, Horus represents that universal struggle, the fight to carry forward the legacy of those we lost, to stand up against betrayal and to accept that the path to justice is rarely swift, often humiliating, but ultimately worth enduring. His myth says to us, even when your eye is taken, even when your enemy drags you through the mud of absurd trials, do not relent, because healing is possible. Restoration is possible, and order, however fragile, can be won. If Horus is the symbol of restoration and Osiris the emblem of justice reborn, then Set is the raw embodiment of chaos. A figure both feared and despised, yet strangely necessary. He is the god of deserts, storms, violence, and unpredictability. The archetypal disruptor who tears apart stability. And while later dynasties condemned him as an enemy of order, his earlier role was more complicated, even essential, when we think of Set. We often imagine only the murderer, the usurper, the jealous brother who dismembered Osiris, but mythology is rarely that simple. Set is also the warrior who stood on Ra's solar boat each night, spear in hand, defending the sun god from Apophis. The chaos serpent that sought to devour the world without Set's ferocity. The serpent might have swallowed creation whole, and this paradox fascinates me, how the same god could be both savior and destroyer, guardian and betrayer. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that chaos is not just an enemy. It is sometimes the very force that preserves life by battling even greater destruction. Yet for all this complexity, Set's defining act, murdering Osiris and scattering his body, marks him as the villain of Egypt's most famous family drama. The story resonates because it touches on a timeless wound, betrayal not by strangers, but by kin. The people closest to us can cause the deepest ruptures, but beyond villainy, Set represents ambition untamed, envy turned corrosive, the drive to dominate even at the cost of harmony, and in this sense, he is as human as he is divine. What's intriguing is how later Egyptians responded to him, erasing his name from temples, suppressing his cult, as if hoping that denial could erase the unsettling truth that chaos lives within every system, and perhaps within every heart. Yet Set endures in myth, not just as a cautionary figure, but as a reminder, a shadow archetype we cannot banish, because without chaos there is no story, no test, no growth. When I think of Set, I see less of a monster and more of a warning, a mirror showing us the part of ourselves that is restless, destructive, jealous, and yet also capable of defending against annihilation. The tragedy of Set is that he could have been remembered as a protector, the god who slew Apophis each night, but his ambition devoured that legacy, turning him into a pariah. His downfall reveals something painfully familiar. When ambition ceases to serve a greater good, it collapses into self-destruction, and the community responds by casting out the one who embodies that imbalance. Set becomes the eternal outsider, the desert storm raging on the edges of Egypt's fertile lands, forever necessary, forever rejected. In his story, we find a paradox that still applies today, that those who disrupt systems can save them or ruin them. depending on whether they fight chaos or become it. If Set embodies the storms that tear life apart, then Anubis is the stillness that follows, the quiet certainty that no matter how chaotic life becomes, death will always bring us to judgment. Anubis is the jackal-headed god of embalming, the weigher of hearts, the silent overseer who never shouts, never rages, but simply waits, and that in itself is terrifying. His role is not to start wars or chase glory, but to shepherd souls into eternity, and what makes him fascinating is his neutrality. Anubis does not punish, he does not reward, he does not bribe. He measures. When you died, your heart was placed on scales opposite the feather of Mat, the principle of truth. And Anubis presided over this ritual with absolute calm. If your heart was lighter, you moved forward into eternal life. If it was heavier, it was fed to Ammit, the devourer, a monster part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, the fusion of all your worst nightmares. Anubis did not gloat when this happened. He did not mourn. He simply ensured the balance was honored, and that is where his true power lies. Because unlike Ra's endless struggle or Osiris's betrayal, Anubis represents the inevitability of consequence. He shows us that at the end of all our striving, our schemes, our betrayals, our ambitions, there will be a scale and there will be truth. What makes his myth even more poignant is that when Osiris was dismembered, it was Anubis who carefully embalmed him, who wrapped his body with sacred oils, who gave him the dignity of becoming the first mummy, and in that act, Anubis not only preserved Osiris, but preserved the concept of legacy itself, ensuring the dead could still have a voice in eternity. This calm, almost clinical devotion reveals a wisdom often overlooked. The dignity in death is as important as power in life, and in a strange way. Anubis embodies compassion through impartiality. He does not bend the rules for anyone, and that fairness is a form of mercy. Compare that to how humans often operate. Bending truths, distorting justice, privileging the powerful. Anubis is the reminder that when it comes to death, all are equal, kings and peasants alike. What I love most about his role is how it shifts our perspective on fear. While other gods terrify through violence or storms, Anubis terrifies through silence. He is the figure in the corner who doesn't need to raise his voice because everyone knows his authority. And perhaps that is why he still resonates with us, because we understand deep down that neutrality is not weakness. It is strength, the ability to stand firm in a world of chaos and simply weigh the truth without flinching. In Anubis we find not a destroyer but a guide, one who reminds us that no matter what masks we wear, in the end our hearts will be measured and no disguise can hide their weight. If Anubis is the silent guide of death, then Thoth is the scribe of eternity, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, science, and the moon. The one who doesn't swing weapons or command armies, but instead holds a pen and a scroll, and somehow that makes him one of the most powerful figures in all of Egyptian thought. Imagine this: while other gods argue, fight, and spill blood, Thoth records. He writes it all down, and in doing so, he shapes how the universe remembers itself, because in mythology, memory is power. He is credited with inventing hieroglyphs, the very language that allowed Egyptians to carve their beliefs into stone and carry them across thousands of years. Without Thoth, the stories of Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus might have vanished like whispers on the wind, but because of him, we still read them today. What's fascinating is how Thoth embodies the paradox of knowledge. On one hand, he is order, bringing structure through calendars, laws, and writing, but on the other, he is also magic, his Book of Thoth said to contain spells capable of controlling gods themselves. It is this duality that makes him so compelling. Wisdom is never neutral. It can preserve life or end it, heal or harm, depending on who holds it. Thoth also plays a crucial role in the afterlife, standing in the Hall of Two Truths during the weighing of the heart, not as a judge like Osiris or a silent guardian like Anubis, but as the recorder, the divine stenographer, ensuring that the truth is written and cannot be erased. Think about the symbolism. Here justice doesn't exist without someone to preserve the record. Memory itself is what guarantees accountability. In this way, Thoth represents something profoundly modern, the recognition that truth without documentation fades and injustice thrives in silence. But Thoth also reminds us that knowledge must be balanced with humility, because, according to legend, he once gambled with the moon god Khonsu to win 5 extra days that allowed the sky goddess Nut to give birth to major gods. In other words, time itself exists because Thoth played a clever game. Knowledge bent the fabric of the cosmos, and that's both inspiring and unsettling. It shows that intelligence can rewrite destiny, but also that meddling with cosmic forces carries consequences. When I reflect on Thoth, I don't just see a god of writing, I see the embodiment of responsibility, the reminder that every word, every record, every calculation has weight. He is the voice whispering that wisdom is power, but power must be wielded carefully, because one careless scroll, one reckless piece of knowledge, can alter history. Thoth teaches us that pens and scrolls can be as mighty as swords, and that in the eternal struggle between chaos and order, truth preserved is the only shield that endures. If Thoth shows us the weight of knowledge, then Bastet reveals the surprising power of softness. The goddess who began as a lioness of blood and fire and transformed over time into the cat-headed protector of homes, fertility, and music. Her story is not just about animals or worship, but about how civilizations reshape their gods as their own needs evolve. Early Bastet was fierce, a lioness who shredded enemies and burned with the sun's rage, but as Egypt shifted from constant warfare toward domestic life and urban growth, her image softened. She became less about destruction and more about protection, less about the battlefield and more about the household. This shift fascinates me because it reflects a broader truth. Sometimes the most enduring power is not found in domination, but in care. By the time she emerged as the familiar feline goddess, Bastet had become the embodiment of joy, music, motherhood, and the quiet strength of guardianship. Yet her softness did not erase her ferocity. Egyptians knew that behind the purr was a predator, and this duality is what made her so beloved. Bastet was worshipped not just by kings, but by ordinary families. Her temples in Bubastis were filled with music, festivals, and cats, both living and mummified. And what does it say about a culture that revered cats so highly they would mummify them in thousands? To me, it says they understood something we sometimes forget, that the creatures who share our homes shape our lives as much as rulers or armies. Bastet's popularity exploded precisely because she bridged the gap between cosmic divinity and daily life. She was not an abstract figure of war or sun. She was the goddess who lived in your home, who kept your children safe, who purred against evil spirits. Her story also carries a warning, because while she was gentle, harming a cat in ancient Egypt could bring death upon you, a testament to how seriously they regarded her protection. In Bastet, we see how a terrifying lioness became a trusted companion. not because her power diminished, but because it was reshaped, turned inward toward nurturing instead of outward toward destruction. And that, I think, is a timeless lesson. True strength is not only the ability to destroy, it is the wisdom to protect, to channel power into care. Bastet teaches us that civilizations, like people, must learn when to roar and when to rest, when to fight and when to protect, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to soften without losing strength. If Bastet shows us the quiet strength of guardianship, then Hathor reveals the wild, intoxicating power of joy itself. She is the goddess of love, beauty, music, fertility, motherhood, and even beer. Yes, beer, because the Egyptians understood that joy, like grain, needed divine protection. But Hathor's story is more complex than just festivals and laughter. For in her we find one of the most dramatic transformations in mythology. She is the gentle, coward goddess who nurtures the pharaoh like a divine mother. Yet she is also the other face of Sekhmet, the lion-headed bringer of destruction, when humanity once mocked Ra. It was Sekhmet who nearly annihilated them, reveling in bloodshed until the gods tricked her into drinking 7,000 jugs of beer dyed red. She awoke, transformed into Hathor, softer, gentler, embodying love instead of wrath. This hangover redemption arc is more than mythic comedy. It carries a profound message about the duality of rage and love, destruction and creation. We often think of these forces as opposites, but Hathor's story suggests they are two faces of the same divine energy. One unchecked becomes slaughter, the other channeled becomes music, celebration, and life. What I find powerful is how Hathor's worship reflects human needs just as much as divine power. Her festivals were filled with music, dancing, drinking, and joy, not as indulgence but as sacred practice, because for Egyptians, pleasure was not sin, it was balance. In honoring Hathor, they acknowledged that without joy, life collapses into despair, and without love, order crumbles into fear at the same time. Her myth warns us that joy without restraint can tip back into chaos, a reminder that our pleasures, like our angers, must be balanced. Hathor was also the goddess who greeted souls in the afterlife, offering milk and music, turning death into something less terrifying. And this maternal, comforting aspect shows us how joy, when rooted in love, becomes a bridge between worlds. In her, we see the paradox of human existence, how the same energy that can destroy us can also save us, how passion can be rage or love depending on how it is directed. Hathor teaches us that joy is not frivolous, it is essential, it is sacred. But it must be cultivated wisely, celebrated with gratitude, and balanced with awareness of its shadow. In her myth we find permission to embrace love, beauty, and music as divine forces, but also a reminder that within every celebration lies the memory of destruction avoided. If Hathor is the laughter of festivals and the gentle embrace of love, then Sekhmet is the roar that silences all joy, the lion-headed goddess of war, plague, vengeance, and yet strangely also of healing. She is the flame unleashed when Ra decided that humanity's disrespect could no longer go unanswered, born from his eye as an embodiment of his wrath. She descended upon humanity like a storm of blood, tearing through villages, delighting in carnage, until even Ra realized she was too powerful, too intoxicated by destruction to stop. This image is terrifying but also revealing, because Sekhmet is not merely rage for rage's sake, she is the consequence of unchecked arrogance and cruelty. the embodiment of what happens when power decides to remind the world who holds it. What fascinates me is how the myth resolves, not through battle, but through intoxication. The gods trick her into drinking beer dyed red, thinking it blood, and in her drunken stupor she collapses, only to wake softened, her fury burned out, transformed into Hathor. This story tells us something timeless, that rage once unleashed is nearly impossible to restrain. It consumes itself, and the only way to end it is to exhaust it, to redirect its fire until it burns out. But even in her softened form, Sekhmet never disappears. Temples dedicated to her were filled with prayers not only for protection, but also for healing. Because the Egyptians understood that the same fire that destroys can also purify, that plague and fever can kill but can also cleanse, and that sometimes the goddess who terrifies you is the same one who saves you. Sekhmet's duality reminds us of our own inner storms, our capacity to destroy, when wounded, disrespected, or enraged, and also our potential to turn that energy into something transformative if it is guided. She is the warning against unchecked wrath, but also the promise that from fire comes renewal. In many ways, Sekhmet is the honesty of human emotion given divine form. She does not pretend to be kind when furious. She does not smile while seething. She rages openly. And in that sense, she is almost refreshing. She reminds us that denial of anger only makes it fester, that acknowledging and even channeling it is healthier than burying it. But she also warns that anger, left unbridled, can consume not just enemies, but the very world you want to protect. Sekhmet is the goddess of consequences, the fire in the blood that heals or kills, the line we all walk when fury tempts us. Her myth endures because she forces us to confront our shadow, the part of us that wakes wanting vengeance, the part we must trick, temper, and transform if we want to survive. If Sekhmet is the roar of destruction, then Ptah is the whisper of creation, the god who does not need armies or storms or even a lion's rage. Because his weapon is imagination itself, Ptah is the patron of artisans, builders, architects, and metalworkers, yet his myth elevates him far beyond the workshop, for he is said to have created the universe by first conceiving it in his heart and then speaking it into being. Imagine that a god who dreams reality into existence and then seals it with a word. There is something profoundly poetic in this, because it mirrors the way human civilization itself is built. Every temple, every city, every invention begins as a thought in someone's mind before it becomes stone or wood. Ptah is the divine embodiment of that process, the recognition that the most enduring acts of creation come not from brute force, but from vision and voice. Unlike Ra or Horus or Set, Ptah is not defined by drama or family feuds. He rarely inserts himself into cosmic battles. Instead, he stands quietly in Memphis, wrapped like a mummy, holding a staff that combines the symbols of life, stability, and power. His skin painted green to symbolize renewal. He is still, silent, and yet essential. What fascinates me is how even other gods were believed to have been first imagined by Ptah, as though everything, even divinity itself, was born in his mind. This elevates him beyond a single domain. He is not just a craftsman's patron, but the architect of possibility. And this has a powerful resonance for us today, because in a world obsessed with speed and noise, Ptah reminds us that the act of imagining quietly is sacred, that creation often comes not with thunder but with silence. His myth also reveals a deep respect the Egyptians had for the builders and artisans who made their civilization possible. The pyramids, temples, and statues were not just feats of labor. They were acts of devotion, and Ptah was their guiding spirit. When I think of Ptah, I see not only a god, but an archetype of human creativity. The figure who whispers that every blueprint matters, every word has weight, and every act of making is an echo of the original act of creation. His stillness is not weakness, but strength. The strength of patience, of planning, of order envisioned before it takes form. In a pantheon filled with conflict and noise, Ptah teaches us the value of quiet work, of shaping the world not through conquest, but through craft. He is the god who reminds us that imagination is divine, and that what we speak, we make real. If Ptah is the quiet force of creation, then Nephthys is the quiet force of grief. The goddess who rarely takes center stage, yet whose presence shapes the entire drama of Egyptian mythology. She is the sister of Isis, Osiris, and Set, which already makes her family life impossibly complicated, and yet she manages to carve a role that is subtle but indispensable. Nephthys is not the radiant strategist like Isis, nor the fiery destroyer like Sekhmet. Instead, she is the mourner, the one who stands beside the tomb, lighting incense, whispering prayers, and guiding souls with dignity. In Egyptian funerary rites, she appears constantly. Her role is to weep, to lament, to grieve openly, and while that might seem secondary compared to the cosmic battles of Ra or Horus, it is actually vital, because grief itself is sacred. Egyptians understood that mourning is not weakness, but devotion, a necessary act to honor life and allow the dead to cross into eternity. Nephthys embodies this role perfectly. Her power is not in wielding swords, but in holding space for pain, and that, in its own way, is as divine as any conquest. Her myth also includes one of the strangest twists in Egyptian Larat. One point she disguises herself as Isis and sleeps with Osiris, producing Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification. This bizarre detail reflects how she often lives in the shadow of others. Even her most famous story is about her pretending to be her sister. Yet from that strange union emerges one of the most important gods of the afterlife, which is itself a reminder that overlooked, hidden, or confusing acts can still birth lasting legacies. Nephthys was not widely worshipped with her own grand temples, but her name was whispered in every funeral, her hymns sung beside every body wrapped in linen. She was the quiet balance to Isis's brilliance, the shadow to her sister's sun. And that balance mattered, because without grief there is no healing. Without mourning there is no closure. Nephthys teaches us the value of the background role, the one who is not celebrated, but whose constancy holds everything together. She is the archetype of the supportive figure, the sibling or friend or stranger who stands silently by when the world is breaking. And though history forgets her, her presence makes survival possible. Her story is a reminder that not all power is visible, that sometimes the strongest gods are the ones who never demanded attention, only gave it. Nephthys shows us that mourning is divine, that holding space for pain is sacred, and that being overlooked does not mean being unimportant, for without her, the Egyptian vision of death and rebirth would be incomplete. If Nephthys is the quiet mourner in the shadows, then Khonsu is the moonlight itself, the god who marks time with every waxing and waning, the one who heals yet sometimes hungers, who comforts yet sometimes terrifies. Khonsu is often depicted as a youthful figure, his head crowned with a crescent moon, his body wrapped like a mummy, a symbol of the eternal cycle of renewal. He was believed to protect travelers, grant fertility, and cure illnesses, and in this role he shines as a benevolent healer, a divine nightlight watching over those who wander in the dark. But his myth also holds a darker side. Some stories describe him as devouring the hearts of those who defy truth, drinking in their essence like a predator cloaked in silver light. This duality fascinates me because it reflects the moon itself, soft and luminous, yet tied to tides, blood, madness, and the unknown. Khonsu's most famous tale tells of him being sent from Thebes to heal a foreign king, and when the statue of Khonsu performed the miracle, the people tried to keep it, not wanting to give back the power of healing. But eventually the god's essence returned home, like a light that cannot be owned, only borrowed. And there is something beautiful in that, a reminder that healing and time itself are not possessions but gifts that pass through us. What I find compelling is that Khonsu is not just about medicine, but about measurement. He is the rhythm of time, the ticking of cycles, the quiet reminder that everything changes, that healing takes time, that journeys are long, that even grief will wax and wane like the moon, yet we cannot ignore his violent side. The myths where he consumes hearts remind us that time itself can be merciless, that the same cycles that bring renewal also bring decay, that the moon which guides the traveler can also expose him to wolves. Khonsu embodies this contradiction. He is both doctor and executioner, protector and predator, and in that way he mirrors our own understanding of time. Time heals, but time also kills. It is the gentlest nurse and the sharpest thief in Khonsu. We see the truth that duality is not contradiction but balance, that light and shadow are not enemies but partners, and that to understand healing we must also acknowledge hunger. To honor time we must accept its devouring edge. Khonsu teaches us that the moon does not choose, it simply shines, and in its glow we find both comfort and fear. If Khonsu is the ticking rhythm of time, then Khnum is the steady hand of creation, the ram-headed god who did not forge the cosmos with fire or command armies of divine warriors, but instead sat patiently at his potter's wheel, molding each human being from the clay of the Nile. Khnum is one of the most tender gods of the Egyptian pantheon, because his mythology insists that every person was handcrafted, not mass-produced, each body and each soul formed with deliberate care, and this detail carries profound meaning. It suggests that individuality is sacred, that no one is an accident. Even the pharaohs were believed to be shaped by Khnum directly, crafted in the womb by his hands, which gave kingship itself a divine legitimacy. Yet the myth also implies responsibility. If every person is sculpted with intention, then every life is worth protecting, every flaw intentional, every gift purposeful. Khnum is also said to control the Nile, the river that brought fertility and destruction in equal measure, and this dual role reflects the truth of creation itself, that to make is also to risk, to shape is also to be responsible for what emerges. What I love most about Khnum's image is how human it feels. A god covered in clay dust, working endlessly like a craftsman in his shop. A reminder that creation is not just lightning bolts and cosmic words, but labor, patience, and artistry. It is easy to imagine him carefully sculpting arms, legs, faces, each unique, and then breathing life into them with quiet devotion. His mirth asks us to think about our own lives as crafted works of art. Fragile, imperfect, and yet intentional. There is also a humbling undertone, because if Kumo crafted us, then he also crafted our flaws, our quirks, our limits, and that suggests that imperfection is not failure but design. In this way, story becomes a meditation on acceptance. He invites us to see our bodies and souls not as mistakes but as creations shaped with purpose. and to treat others as vessels of the same divine care. Khem's wheel keeps spinning endlessly, reminding us that creation is not a single act, but an ongoing process, and that each generation, like each vessel, is unique but connected to the same river of life. In him we find the reassurance that we are not massed shadows in the crowd, but deliberate works shaped by divine hands, and the challenge to live as if our individuality carries responsibility. If Khnum is the gentle craftsman shaping humanity, then Tawaret is the ferocious guardian who ensures those creations make it safely into the world. She is the goddess of childbirth, pregnancy, and maternal protection. Yet, unlike the soft and serene image many cultures assign to motherhood, Tawaret is depicted with the body of a pregnant hippopotamus, the limbs of a lion, and the tail of a crocodile. A hybrid form that is both nurturing and terrifying. This imagery is no accident. The Egyptians understood that childbirth was not only sacred but also dangerous. It was blood, pain, and risk, and so their goddess of maternity embodied both tenderness and ferocity. Tawaret is often shown standing upright, her round belly protruding, holding protective amulets. Her very presence a warning to evil spirits: do not come near, because here is a mother ready to kill for her child. And what I find compelling is how this reverses the stereotype of vulnerability. Tawaret is not a weak guardian of fragile life. She is the fierce embodiment of survival. Egyptians placed her image on beds, headrests, amulets, and even drinking vessels, invoking her protection at the most intimate and vulnerable moments. Her power was personal, domestic, woven into the daily lives of ordinary people, and that intimacy made her beloved. She wasn't a distant cosmic ruler, but a presence in every home, watching over women in labor, cradling newborns, protecting families from the unseen dangers of night. Yet her form also reminds us that motherhood is not soft simplicity. It is wild, raw, and animal. It is the hippo that will charge to defend her calf, the lioness that tears apart threats, the crocodile that lurks beneath the surface ready to strike. Tawaret embodies this primal truth, that motherhood is as much about survival as it is about nurturing, and in that sense she is deeply honest. While other gods were worshipped in grand temples, Tawaret was worshipped in households, whispered to in the cries of labor, thanked quietly when both mother and child survived. She teaches us that protection is sacred, that motherhood is power, and that divinity does not only shine in temples or palaces, but in the blood and struggle of everyday life. Tawaret stands as a reminder that the fierce, protective energy of mothers is not a secondary form of strength, but one of the most essential. Without it, none of the grand myths of gods and kings would even exist, because none of them would have survived their first breath. If Tawaret is the fierce guardian of birth, then Sobek is the raw hunger of the river itself. The crocodile god, who embodies both terror and blessing, he is the Nile with teeth, a deity who could swallow you whole or feed your fields depending on his mood. Sobek is often shown as a man with the head of a crocodile, his scales gleaming, his jaws wide. And in that image we see the duality of water. It nourishes, but it also drowns. It sustains life, but it also devours it. Egyptians both feared and revered Sobek, because the Nile was everything to them. Too much water meant flood and destruction. Too little meant famine. And crocodiles lurking in its waters reminded them that survival was always precarious. To worship Sobek was not only to ask for protection, but also to acknowledge fear, and that honesty is powerful, unlike gods who represent ideals of justice or wisdom. Sobek embodies nature's indifference. His favor could make fields flourish. His wrath could swallow entire villages. Yet what is fascinating is how Egyptians integrated this fear into reverence. They built temples for him, especially in regions where crocodiles were abundant, and even raised crocodiles in sacred pools, adorning them with jewels, feeding them like embodiments of Sobek himself. This is remarkable because it shows a cultural willingness not to deny danger but to honor it, to say, yes, we fear you, but we will live with you. Sobek was also linked to military strength. Pharaohs invoked his power to strike fear into enemies, seeing in the crocodile not just a predator but a symbol of ferocity and dominance. Yet his other role was fertility, because the Nile's floods that brought destruction also deposited the silt that made Egypt's soil rich. Sobek's jaws were a warning, but his river was a gift. His myth captures the essence of balance in Egyptian thought, that creation and destruction are inseparable, that the same river that drowns your child may also feed your grandchildren. When I reflect on Sobek, I see the honesty of a people who did not romanticize nature but embraced its contradictions. They knew that to live meant to stand in awe of forces beyond their control, to offer respect to what could destroy them, and in that act of reverence, they found a strange kind of harmony. Sobek teaches us that fear is not weakness, it is awareness, and that sometimes the wisest way to survive is not to conquer danger, but to acknowledge it, to treat the jaws of the crocodile not only as a threat, but also as a source of power. Sobek is the river itself, patient, unpredictable, life-giving, and deadly, a reminder that every blessing comes with risk, and every life is carried on waters that can turn violent in an instant. If Sobek is the river that feeds and devours, then Nut is the sky that shelters and remembers. She is often depicted arched across the heavens, her body studded with stars, her arms and legs stretching to embrace the world. She is the eternal canopy protecting creation from the chaos beyond. But within her lies one of the most radical myths in Egyptian lore, a story where even the stars themselves dared to rebel. Nut gave birth to the lights of the night, each star a child, each constellation a story, and for ages these stars followed the command of Ra, moving in ordered paths, guiding priests and sailors, shining as signs of divine control. But not all agreed with this order. Among them was Tyet, a lesser-known goddess of weaving and patterns, who began to see obedience not as harmony but as tyranny. She wove her defiance into the sky, hiding messages in constellations, patterns that whispered of freedom, secret paths, forgotten names. When Ra decreed that stars could no longer show mortals the way to forbidden truths, Tyet refused. She chose rebellion, and her defiance spread. First one star vanished, then 10, then hundreds. They folded inward, refusing to shine, retreating into silence. The world below descended into chaos. Crops failed, birds lost their migration paths, priests cursed the heavens, and sailors drowned under starless skies. But what strikes me most is that this was not rebellion against mortals, it was rebellion for them. The stars were not abandoning humanity, they were refusing to be instruments of control. And in that act they revealed something profound, that even light can choose silence when forced to serve injustice. Into this starless age steps a mortal Pamu, a scholar from Thinis, who refused to give up watching the sky, even when it was empty. He remembered seeing Tyet's light once as a child, guiding him in the desert, and he believed she was not gone, but waiting. And in time she came to him in dreams, handing him a thread of starlight, inviting him to climb into the body of Nut herself. This myth reframes everything, for it suggests that mortals are not just passive receivers of divine order, they are participants in rebellion, co-creators of new meaning. Pamu's journey to the sky is not about restoring obedience, but about remembering freedom, choosing to honor Tyet instead of betraying her, and when he does, the stars return, not in neat lines, but in wild, living patterns, imperfect, chaotic, and beautiful. They shine not as servants of Ra, but as storytellers, mirrors of defiance. This myth is extraordinary because it transforms the stars from symbols of order into symbols of choice. Each flicker in the night sky becomes an act of remembrance, a reminder that even light is not bound forever, and when we look up today, perhaps we still see not perfection but freedom, constellations that are more than maps, they are rebellions stitched into the dark. If Nut is the sky that holds the stars, then Pamu is the mortal who dared to question why those stars had vanished. His story begins not with power, but with emptiness, a young astronomer tracing phantom constellations on the roof of his crumbling home, mocked by others for staring at a blank sky, yet refusing to forget what once was. That stubbornness becomes his gift. For one night, Tyet appears to him in dream, weaving a thread of starlight into his hand, and with it he climbs upward into the very body of the sky goddess, into realms where memory itself lives. What fascinates me about Pamu is not that he reaches the gods, but that he is asked to choose. When he enters the court of Ra, the sun god offers him a bargain. Return Tyet, the rebellious star, bind her, and in exchange the stars will shine again in perfect obedient order. The world below will prosper, famine will end, navigation will return, but at the cost of freedom, at the cost of silencing defiance forever. Imagine the weight of that choice. Millions of lives could be saved, yet only by betraying the one star who had once guided him as a lost child in the desert. Tyet does not beg, she does not demand. She simply reminds him that obedience is not the same as harmony, that silence is not the same as peace. Pamu trembles, because he knows the people below are starving, but he also knows that a world built on silence is not truly alive, and so he refuses Ra's bargain. He gives the thread back to Tyet, and in that moment the heavens ignite, not in orderly lines, but in chaotic, living constellations, imperfect, asymmetric, dazzling. The stars return, not as tools of Ra, but as acts of freedom. And this choice transforms Pamu. He is no longer just a scholar, he becomes a listener, one who understands that memory itself is rebellion, that remembering what was lost is the first step to restoring what matters. When I reflect on this story, I see it as a mirror of our own struggles. How often are we offered comfort at the cost of truth, order at the cost of freedom, stability at the cost of silencing the voices that dissent? Pamu reminds us that sometimes the harder choice, the one that prolongs struggle, that resists easy order, is the one that preserves what makes us human. Tyet's constellation becomes a loom in the sky, weaving threads that mortals can follow, not to obey, but to remember. Her rebellion is no longer exile, it is light freely given, and Pamu's defiance shows us that even a single mortal can tilt the balance between tyranny and freedom. The lesson is profound. Do not trade silence for light, for true light only shines when it is chosen, not commanded. When we step back from the endless dramas of Ra and Osiris, Isis and Horus, Set and Anubis, Thoth and Bastet, Hathor and Sekhmet, Ptah and Nephthys, Khonsu and Khnum, Tawaret and Sobek, Nut and Tyet, what we see is not just a pantheon of strange animal-headed deities, but a mirror of ourselves. Each god embodies a fragment of the human condition. Ra is endurance, the exhaustion of endless responsibility. Osiris is loss and renewal, the reminder that wounds can become wisdom. Isis is resilience and cunning, the power of love that refuses to be silenced. Horus is justice fought for across decades. Set is chaos and ambition, both necessary and dangerous. Anubis is consequence, the certainty that truth will be weighed. Thoth is knowledge, the understanding that memory preserves justice. Bastet is softness turned into strength. Hathor is joy transformed from rage. Sekhmet is fury unchecked and then tempered. Ptah is creation through imagination. Nephthys is grief honored as sacred. Khonsu is time, both healing and devouring. Khnum is individuality shaped by care. Tawaret is maternal ferocity. Sobek is the river that blesses and destroys. Nut is the canopy that shelters all. And Tyet is rebellion, the light that refuses to obey. Together they do not form a neat theology, but a living tapestry of contradiction, a mythic map of everything it means to be alive. What fascinates me most is how the Egyptians did not try to erase contradiction. They embraced it. Their gods were not perfect. They were flawed, furious, tired, jealous, grieving, creative, protective, chaotic, and kind. And in that mess of contradictions they found truth. Because life is not clean, it is both love and rage, order and chaos, silence and song, destruction and creation. Their mythology survives because it never asked us to see gods as distant ideals, but as mirrors of our own struggles, the fight to endure, the grief of betrayal, the joy of love, the terror of death, the longing for justice, the hunger for freedom. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson, that myths do not exist to tell us what gods were. They exist to remind us what we are, to warn us of our shadows, to inspire us with our light, and to whisper across millennia that endurance, love, justice, and freedom are not divine gifts but human choices, fragile, costly, and worth making again and again. When we look at Ra sailing the sun, at Isis reassembling Osiris, at Horus fighting Set, at Tyet refusing obedience, we are really looking at ourselves, at the parts of us that wake weary and still rise, that are torn apart and still rebuild, that are betrayed and still seek justice, that are silenced and still refuse to be quiet. The Egyptians wrapped these truths in gods and monsters, in scales and feathers, in crocodiles and cats, but beneath the symbols lies a simple, powerful reminder. We are the ones who keep the world moving, who endure chaos, who shape clay, who protect children, who weigh truth, who create, who grieve, who rebel, and if even the gods stumbled, raged, and faltered, yet still preserved balance, then so can we.